Okay, today we're going to do inflation 2. We're going to compare prices over time, give examples of how prices change due to inflation, and finally give some advice as to how thoughts of inflation can inform our decisions and how inflation changes the way people think. Some real world applications about how the idea of inflation affects us. Okay, the two vocabulary words we need to know today, we're going to use a lot. So get these into the brain. So we use them a lot. So real dollars means the prices adjusted for inflation. And usually we'll be adjusting to the current year. So think in today's money. Whereas nominal dollars means the sticker price for that year. So if you pick up something that's 20 years old and it has the original sticker price for $5, $5 20 years ago, that's the nominal dollars. How much would that be if it was inflated every year for 20 years? That would be the real dollars. A note about this. Factoring in inflation is extremely important if you want to do any heavy thinking about prices, wages, or the economy over time. It is impossible to correctly think about average salary, minimum wage, the price of the stock market as a whole, production called the GDP, gross domestic product, the production of America, that's how much the U.S. produces per year. It is impossible to think over time without understanding the importance of inflation. Anyone can understand prices currently within the year, but as soon as you expand that over, and you'll be right thinking this year, last year, you'll be within 2%. But 3 years ago, 4 years ago, now your mind is off like by about 5 or 6%. And if you start thinking 10 years ago, your mind is starting to be off in how it thinks about things by upwards of 20%, a huge factor. So understanding inflation and adjusting prices to get a good graph or a good concept of how you're thinking about things is essential to do any continuity through time thinking about anything to do with prices or money. So let's get into the process of what we call adjusting for inflation. And that's becoming the term real dollars. Most people use adjusted for inflation. Well, let's just say you'll see it 3 different ways. If you're looking at a graph or if you're looking at a set of numbers, you're either going to see the term adjusted for inflation, real dollars, or in 1994 or 2018 dollars. That means everything has been adjusted to the same standard. So what we're doing is we're taking prices from the past, dollars from the past, and converting them or adjusting them for inflation into what the price would be today. So if we remember our yearly percent increase in prices of the CPI, the inflation rate, what we're saying is, like, if you were in year 2000 and had $100, in year 2001, you would need $103, 3% inflation, to have the same purchasing power as you did in 2000. And so then you take that $103, and in 2002, you would need about $104 to have to buy the same amount of stuff as you could with $100 in 2000. Okay, so that's when we're saying when we're converting into real dollars, we have $100 in year 2000. Well, what would you need in 2020 to be able to purchase the same amount of stuff as 2000 you? So we're saying $100 in 2000 has $100 of value in 2000, but you need 100 in how much in 22 for those values purchasing power to be equal. So instead of doing the math from one year to the other, we have a program that does all the math. It takes $100 in whatever starting year and puts it through every single year of inflating to see what it'd be worth at an ending year. Okay, so it's what's called an inflation calculator. Let's take that same example. If in the year 2000 you had $100, and then in year 2001 you would need 102.79 for those to be equal. Another way of saying it, to have the same purchasing power. Another way of saying it is if something cost $100 in 2000, it would then cost $102.80 in 2001. And you can see just from the chart, from 2000 to 2001, there was a 2.8% inflation, and that's 2.8%. It's doing the work for us. So converting to current dollars is converting past money into something you understand, because you understand the purchasing power of current dollars. You understand what is expensive and what is not expensive currently. So when we convert money or prices from the past into current dollars, your brain then understands how expensive something was back then. For example, and I went back to some historical prices. I went back to myself. I went back to my parents to get some prices. And my parents clearly remember in 1975, they could buy a gallon of gas for about 35 cents. Now, if I asked you, they were paying 35 cents for a gallon of gas in 1975. Was that a good deal or not? Were they paying a lot for gas or were they paying a little? You have no clue, because the dollar purchasing powers of a dollar are different. So what we would do is, once again, this is what we're taking the nominal price in 1975, 35 cents per gallon of gas, and we're turning it into today's dollars so you can understand. So let's see what it would be in today's dollars, because prices always rise. When my parents bought a gallon of gas for 35 cents in 1975, that would be the same as me paying $1.70 today. Well, I know that gas costs more than $1.70. Gas costs $2, $2.30. So I knew gas costs less for them back then, because it felt like I would be paying $1.70. If I could buy gas for $1.70, it would feel the same as my parents buying it for 35. But since I can't buy it for $1.70, I have to pay more. Okay, we see that gas's price has risen more than inflation. If gas was still $1.70, we would say gas was even with inflation since 1975, or comparing the 2 years. Now, there's a little interesting thing that we are assuming here. We're assuming that we're both making about the same amount of money when we do this sort of thing. And interestingly enough, the average worker from around 1975 all the way up to current, the average wage has stayed with inflation, okay? So the average worker in 1975 had the same purchasing power. They could buy the same loaves of bread as the average worker today. If the average worker in 1975 could buy 10,000 loaves of bread, the average worker in the U.S. today could buy the same 10,000 loaves of bread. So our average salaries are already basically adjusted for inflation. And because that's true, we can just adjust the cost of things to feel how it would be. So let's give two more examples because I find them incredibly interesting, okay? So let's take an example of 1987. In 1987, the Nintendo Entertainment System, the original, came out, and it was being sold for $100. That's with a Mario game and 2 controllers, okay? So in 1987, you would spend $100. Is that a lot? Well, we have to adjust the dollars to today's thinking. We've got to adjust them to 2020. So I remember buying an NES growing up. When we bought it for $100 for me, my parents' money, it was just like I going out and buying a PS5 for $230. Whoa. Now you say, wait a minute. PS5s go for a lot more than that. Yep. They have outpaced inflation. The price of video game consoles has risen faster than inflation. As an interesting note, just because I know these numbers, if you wanted to buy like the first home video game system, the Atari 2600, which I did own, I think we got it later when the price came down, because if you bought it the very first time it came out in 1977, you would have paid $199, which would feel like buying a video game system for $855 today. Another example, in 1926, you could get a new car, the Model T, for $360. That would be like buying a new car today for $5,000. Now that's because Henry Ford made the Model T super, super cheap. Cars before the Model T were about $800 in the 1920, and that would be like buying a car for $10,000. So still relatively similar. In 1980, my parents bought a Toyota Corolla for $8,000, and that to them, it felt like you today buying a new car for $25,000. And that's how the inflation calculator works to look at past prices or past salaries or wages or minimum wages to see how it feels in today's dollars. The second thing we can use an inflation calculator for, and adjusting to real dollars, is to see the current purchasing power of an amount of money, okay? So you could think of, oh, what does something cost back then? What would it cost today? You could also think, if I had X amount of dollars in the past, how much would that equal? How much would I have today to keep the purchasing power equal? So we can use this inflation calculator to answer the question. If you had $60,000 in 1964, were you rich? You can't just say, well, if I had $64,000 today, I'm not rich. Although if you have $64,000 in the bank, you're like the top 10% of all Americans, okay? That's pretty good. So you have to convert it. So if we were in 1964 and you had $60,000, that would be the same as somebody in 2020 having in the bank $500,000. So someone tooling around in 1964 with 60 grand in their pocket is the same as someone walking around in 2020 with $500,000 in their pocket. So this is the second version, another way of thinking of using the inflation calculator. And it's so much easier than using the chart and doing a whole page of math. Let me take a second, even though I'll probably talk about this later. Let me show you in graph form what I said about real wages haven't really increased since the 60s and 70s in the United States. Now, notice I used that term real wages. What that means, nominal wages has increased. In 1964, the average was making $2.50 an hour. And in 2018, the average was $22 an hour. So the nominal wages has moved up. But what else has moved up every single year? The prices, okay? So you expect prices to rise and you expect wages to rise with the prices. Now, I said real wages. So someone in 1964 was making $2.50. When we put that through the calculator per hour, they feel, it's like a 2018 person, it feels like they were making $20 an hour, okay? So if you were in 1990 making $10 an hour, if you were making $10 in 1990, it felt, and you could buy the same much of stuff as if you were making $22 in 2018. So in real dollars, the purchasing power of the average hourly wage, look at that top graph, from 1964 basically stays the same. However much someone could purchase, the average worker in 2018 was the same amount of stuff the average worker could purchase in 1964. That's why I'm saying real wages, purchasing power of the job, stays roughly the same. All right, so this next way of comparing prices over time, I've seen it used a couple times. It's not as accurate. There's much more numbers involved and studies involved with the consumer price index and inflation. This is much more going on. You need to have some firm numbers before you can use this. And the technique is to compare costs to average wages or compare cost to starting salaries. Okay. See, you can compare prices of something to the average wage at the time to see a comparison. And you could do that as like a percentage of the yearly salary, or you can convert things into hours of work needed to purchase something. And so the first example, let's use I have the direct numbers from my parents' house when they purchased it in 1975, which my mother was pregnant with me, and that is the glorious year of my birth. And so what more do you need than a new house and a new favorite child? Of course, their only child at that point, so obviously the favorite. The house was purchased for $28,000. Now, was that a good deal? Was that not a good deal? That'd be like purchasing using our friend inflation calculator. Using our friend inflation calculator, that would mean purchasing a house for about $135,000 today. I think that's a pretty good deal. So housing, we would assume would be a little cheaper back then because it's tough to find in this area a house for $135,000. That's what it felt like to them purchasing it in 1975. Well, there's another way of looking at it. The average yearly salary in 1975 was $10,000. So that house was about 3 times a yearly salary, 2.8 times someone's average yearly salary. Now, that would mean that we could compare the multiplication of today's average salary to the house value. The house value today, it's gone from $28,000 to $200,000, and that is 4.4 times the average yearly salary of someone, because the average yearly salary in 2020 is $45,000. So we could see that the price of the house rose from roughly 3 times the average salary. Well, now that house in that area is worth 4.4 times the average salary. So you could start thinking about prices in that way. You could think of it this way too. In 1975, my parents had to spend 2.8 times or 3 times their yearly salary to get a very nice house, a totally acceptable house. Well, in the area today, I would say a totally acceptable house is $150,000 in certain towns. And that is 3.3 times. So whereas my parents could get a totally acceptable house for 2.8 times their starting salary, today in roughly the same area, you're going to have to spend 3.3 times your yearly salary to get the same type of house or the same acceptability of a house. Okay? So we could see that the housing prices in this certain area of the US have gone up more than inflation, more than yearly salaries. Let's look at the way of using how many hours it takes to purchase something over time. So let's take something fairly similar. In the year 2000, was the year the PS2 was released. First year the PlayStation 2 was released, and it had a release price of $300. So how does that compare to the PS5 being released in 2020? Are they comparable? I mean, is one a better deal than the other? We have to adjust for inflation. So the average hourly wage in the year 2000 was $14 an hour, which means you would spend 21 hours of work, half a week, working to pay for your new PS2. Okay, well the PS5 is coming out at $500, and in the year 2020, the average hourly rate is $23 an hour. So that means you need to work 21.7 hours to pay for your new PS5. That's really close. In the 2000s, someone had to work 21 hours to get their new PS2. In 2020, someone had to work 21.7 hours in a few minutes to get their new PS5. Let's see if inflation and this calculation is done specific, so we know that they're roughly equal in value across time. And this was done purely by average salary. Let's see if inflation calculator agrees with us. So in 2000, the new PS2 cost $300. And in 2020, you would expect to pay $453, which is pretty close to $500. And we see you have to work almost an extra hour, which is close to $18 extra. It's close. So if we adjusted for real dollars based on inflation, we could see that the value of PS2 and PS5 is very similar. And if we did it by hours needed to work to buy one, we could see it's also similar. Let's use this salary comparison method for something that's really important. Not that video game systems aren't important and not that houses aren't important, because they certainly are. Let's see what's happened to private colleges since 1994. Everyone knows if they've been paying attention. If you've been paying attention, the cost of private college has so far increased more than wages have increased and more than inflation. Healthcare and the cost of private colleges has skyrocketed so much that it is entirely a different world. So let's take a look with the numbers that I know and that I can remember fairly well. In 1994, it was roughly, to go to the private college of Ithaca, in 1994, it was roughly $20,000 for tuition and room and board, living and eating. The average salary, according to some websites, for 1994 was $26,000. So you could see that going to college for 1 year was 23% less, 0.77 times an average salary. So if college rose at the same rate of everything else, we would expect it to be less than a year's of average salary. But fast forward to 2020. 2020, the cost of tuition and room and board is per year, this is per year, $65.5 thousand to go to, what is it, like 8 months of school? And the average salary has increased from $26,000 to roughly $48,000. And so you see, attending Ithaca College for 1 year is now, instead of 23% less than the American average salary, it is now 36% more than the average annual salary. So if I were to graph this, I would see a line of price going up 2% a year, which is inflation since the 90s. Prices go up 2% a year, but private colleges go up way more than 2% a year. They're what we call outpacing inflation. If private colleges were going up the same as bread, the same as everything else, let's see what inflation calculator says Ithaca should be today. If private colleges were going up just like everything else, then you should be able to go to a private college or Ithaca for $35,000 a year, but that's not true because it costs $65,000. So the increase has outpaced inflation dramatically. And when we start looking at the cost of colleges in relation to starting salaries, it's becoming unbelievably high. That is why the cost of private colleges, if you don't get free money today, is entirely different universe than the cost of colleges for your parents or your grandparents. Just to be complete, we can do this calculation with the SUNY system, the State University of New York, okay? Because I know the prices of that in 1994. In 1994, attending SUNY for 1 year, tuition and room and board, was 38% of an average salary. 2020, attending SUNY for 1 year is 45% of an average salary. So yes, it's gone up. It's not the same 38%, but it seems kind of reasonable. Whereas once again, for private schools, it was 1 year was 77% of the average salary in 1994, and now it's 136% more than the average salary. So the comparison is night and day. The private colleges have risen so much more than State University has risen. So let's look at a graph to see if our two ways of figuring the cost of college were correct. We use two ways. We use the inflation calculator to show that the current cost of private education is way more than just inflation. We use the average salary method to see that the cost of college now, as opposed to 1994, is way more of a percent of average salary. Okay, and so someone's put this up on a graph, and it shows exactly what we just said. So if we're looking at going from 1985, prices rose 107%. So this is the average consumer price index. Okay, this is inflation, average inflation. And we see in that same time span how college rose much, 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 much more, the cost of college, than all other prices rose. So all other prices since 1985 rose 107%. Colleges rose, what was that? 466%. So the graph shows that our two methods worked. You know, I'm going to leave it there. That's enough playing around with real and nominal dollars. We'll save the advice for a future lesson. All right. Thanks for watching.